Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour Saga 960. Tomorrow is Election Day in the United States. We just heard from Conrad Black, obviously a very well-known columnist in both Canada and the United States, as well as in the UK. And now I wanted to check in with two of my classmates who live and work and are involved in lots of different activities in the United States. Steve Schomburger, who is an insurance consultant and expert in Chicago, Illinois, and Girish Nadkarni, who is a venture capitalist and a financier in Connecticut. Steve and Girish, welcome to my show. How are you?
Thank you, Brian.
So maybe, Steve, I can start with you. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow?
Everything, I think, tells me Biden's going to win substantially, but there's a small inside straight path where Donald Trump could possibly win. I think it's improbable. I think it's unlikely. Same words could have been used to describe 2016. So could lightning strike twice? Sure. Will it? Doubtful. We'll see.
Now, Steve, I think the key to the election, from what at least here in Canada we hear, is what people call is the blue wall, that I guess are 3 or 4 different formerly Democratic states. Some of them stayed Democratic. 3 of them went Republican during the last election, all Midwestern, all industrial states. What do you think of Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, et cetera?
So it's fascinating. So here in Chicago, overwhelmingly Democratic, overwhelmingly blue. Illinois is going to go blue no matter what. I don't think there's any issue with where I live. However, this past summer, I went golfing with my son, both in Michigan and Wisconsin. And what's fascinating was once we drove beyond the cities, 98, 99, 100% of the signs were all pro-Trump. So it's really, I think, going to happen is, are the municipalities going to vote Democratic? Yes. Are outlying areas going to vote Republican? Overwhelmingly, yes. So it's a matter of numbers. So where I live, everybody's already voted overwhelmingly Democratic. But where I've been outside of the big cities, exact opposite is true, is my suspicion. Very, very Republican. Very, very many people have not voted yet. So it's a numbers game, pure and simple, in my opinion. So
according to the pundits, at least the ones that I listen to, the urban centers are Democratic, and as you say, the rural places are Republican. But the key to victory is auto workers and other industrial blue-collar workers, typically older, middle-aged or older, primarily white males that used to have jobs in industry, may still have jobs in industry and or no longer do. And that's the key to success, which may be a little bit more suburban than the 2 that we just talked about. What's your sense? Has Trump been able to keep those auto workers and other old line industrial workers in the Republican Trump sphere, or have they gone back Democratic where they used to be?
I think, first of all, I don't know, but my sense is that one of the reasons why people did not vote for Hillary Clinton is that they did not like her. She was a very qualified individual, eminently qualified, but people just did not like her. Biden, I think, is very, very likable. And to a large extent, I think whoever wins any political contest, it's a popularity contest. And if Joe Biden is 4% more likable, 5% more likable, 6% more likable than Hillary Clinton, plus he also saved with Barack Obama the auto industry in Michigan, I think he's going to get enough swing voters between the likability and the auto industry. Plus he's from Scranton, Pennsylvania. So he's one of them. He's white, male, one of them. I think he's going to, it's 4%, 5%, 6%, he's going to get enough of the voters who voted for Hillary to go back voting for him. That's my sense.
Girish, maybe I can turn to you. You're in Connecticut, so on the coast. And one of the interesting things, I think from the outside, looking at the United States, is how the coast, particularly the major urban centers, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, et cetera, all vote Democratic and resoundingly so. So I presume Connecticut, New York, et cetera, are solid Biden. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair assumption. And as Brian, I spend a large part of my time in Europe as well. So in some ways, I get the my sense is not just living in Connecticut, but also watching news when I'm overseas or talking to people there. So it's kind of a looking at it from two different perspectives. Generally, I would agree with you, at least the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, generally tend to be blue. But as you go further up, places like Maine, where Susan Collins comes from, is a good question. New Hampshire is not necessarily blue. I believe it voted for Trump the last time, and particularly the rural areas. And as you come down in the mid-Atlantic states, as you come close, of course, Delaware hopefully should be carried by Biden, but as you come down, North Carolina, etc., North Carolina seems to be a toss-up at this point. So yes, the coast is typically blue with definitely issues around certain states.
It's interesting. I, as you may know, have a place on Long Island. So I travel, I drive from Canada down to Long Island frequently. And upper New York State is very Trump, very Republican. And then out on Long Island, same thing. And so I go through a Republican area on my drive down, go through a Democratic area as I go through the city. And then when I get out on Long Island, it's extremely Republican all over again.
It makes sense to some extent. And I just wanted to pick on what Steve said about this being a popularity contest. But I think it's not just a popularity contest between two candidates. I think it's also a popularity contest between two groups of people or two parts of society. The intelligentsia versus the rural, or the blue collar versus the white collar, etc. And so if you see how people are voting from where, there's I believe an article in the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago, or maybe when Hillary lost, as to why are the blue collar really voting for Trump? And the answer in that article was, it's not that the blue collar is envious or doesn't like rich people. It just doesn't like the managerial class. It doesn't like the young uppity manager who has a Harvard business degree coming in and telling them what to do. But the self-made rich people they look up to, because their belief is anybody with a little luck and hard work can get there. And so to some extent, I also see this as, the uneducated white man sticking it to the educated people, right? Which also explains the death of expertise, which also explains why they refuse to believe in science, which also explains why they don't like the fact that Fauci is telling them what to do. So it's a pretty significant issue around, it's almost as if we are sort of pulling back from the age of enlightenment.
So, Girish, what do you think is going to happen on Tuesday?
My take, okay, and it's worth every penny you paid me for it, is it really, if you look at the polls, it seems as if Biden is ahead. And the mistake we did in 2016 was look at the national polls rather than the regional or the local polls, right? So on a total population perspective, Biden may be ahead, as was Hillary. And in fact, she got 3 million more votes. What really matters, as we all know, is the Electoral College. But what's different this time is because of COVID, there is a whole issue of absentee ballots and mail ballots. So the issue is not just a matter of who gets the most votes, but who gets the most votes which are actually counted. Okay? And so one scenario is, on election day, if just based upon the votes cast just on that day, if Trump is ahead, he will do everything in his power, and he has said so, this is not me speculating, he will do everything in his power to stop the vote count. I mean, think of this as, Florida, Gore versus Bush on steroids. So they will challenge it every which way, prevent the votes from being counted, and avoid, and the general assumption is that most of the people who have done mail-in voting have really been Democratic. And so he's going to try to prevent that. And to the extent, at some level, he doesn't really care where those votes are for whom. So long as he thinks he's ahead, all he has to do is maintain that lead.
But the issue, Girish, isn't mail-in votes. It's mail-in votes that are received after Election Day. And already what you've encountered, I think, in the United States, both with early voting as well as mail-in votes, is turnout that is is astronomical. It rivals close to the total turnout from 2016. Is that not correct? And in high turnouts, doesn't that typically benefit Democrats?
I don't think it's just a simple matter of votes received after election day. I believe it's also votes to be counted after election day. So they may muddy the waters by saying, even if the votes were received before, if they haven't been counted, there is potential in their argument for mischief there.
Well, and we hear stories of, buildings being boarded up in downtown Washington, D.C. Do you think there is a real issue? It's hard for me to believe, but is there a real issue of civil unrest depending on who wins and who loses?
Who knows? I would not be surprised either way. Let's put it that way.
Really, it's shocking. In the gleaming city on the hill, the beacon of democracy worldwide, thinking about.
Well, no, agreed. I mean, I don't know if you saw the story in Texas, where armed people in trucks were blocking the Biden campaign bus and not allowing it to make stops. I mean, if people can do that today in broad daylight, okay, and if people and armed vigilantes can plan the kidnapping of the Michigan governor or the Ohio governor, what is to say that these, and remember what Trump said at the last debate. He said, stand down and stand by. What does stand by mean?
Steve, what do you think about what Girish says?
So I agree with what he said. What's confusing about the U.S. election is that each election is governed by each state, and each state has different election laws. So some votes have to be in by election day, some can be counted later, some can be sent in later as long as they're postmarked. And already, to your point, there are so many different lawsuits already. I don't know if there's dozens or hundreds of lawsuits already going through the courts. There's a huge lawsuit, as you're probably well aware, in Texas about these 100,000 plus voters that went through drive-through voting. And then that gets into, is the law by the legislature? We going by what the courts have ruled? And I think it's going to be a morass of lawsuits afterwards. And are these state lawsuits? Are these federal lawsuits? Are they legislature lawsuits? Are they state court justice lawsuits? And my hope is that the election is not close. My hope is that in a state such as Texas, it's going to be decided by hundreds of thousands, plural, or millions of votes, as opposed to hundreds of votes as we had in Florida with Bush and Gore. 537 votes this time. There's so many different scenarios that it could be just a complete mess. So we'll see what the votes are. Right now, to Girish's point, the hypothesis, which I agree with, is that most of the early votes have been Democratic. But the hypothesis also is that the votes on Tuesday, tomorrow, will be overwhelmingly Republican. So we'll see where it goes.
We're chatting with Girish Nadkarni and Steve Schomburger, two classmates of mine, both living and working in the United States, Girish in Connecticut and Steve in Chicago. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Girish and Steve in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Tomorrow is the election in the United States. We just heard from Conrad Black and his very strong views as to what he thinks should happen in the election. And then we've chatted with Steve Schomburger and Girish Nadkarni, Steve from Chicago and Girish from Connecticut, about what they think will happen. And now I'd like to ask them what they think should happen. Girish, maybe this time I can start with you. You've lived and worked in Europe, in the United States. And so you've seen U.S. From up close, and you've seen the United States election from afar. What do you think should happen in the election on Tuesday?
I am a strong believer in institutions. I'm a strong believer in processes. And, there is a reason why people who are immigrants come from places like India, China, Nigeria, whatever, and succeed in America. And the reason, it's the same talent. But the reason they do better in America is because the institutions and the processes and the environment is different, right? And so my perspective or belief is, yes, I am a certain partisan, and I will acknowledge I am sort of socially liberal, fiscally conservative. I tend democratic, etc. And I recognize that there are times when a Republican can win, and there are times when a Democrat can win, and pendulum goes back and forth. What I worry about is damage to the institutions and damage to the guardrails, and that is what has unfortunately happened. I voted for Obama, but if Romney had won, I wouldn't have feared a catastrophe. Okay, he would have had some policies which I wouldn't have liked, and maybe some I did. But with Trump, it's not just a question about, or the Republicans for that matter, it's not a question about their policies. It's a question about how they're treating the institutions which have held in place this country or the world at large. And so what I'm looking for is not necessarily whether A wins or B wins. I'm looking for a comeback to where rules matter, norms matter, how we behave with each other matter. That is far more important. It takes centuries and decades to build up these guardrails and build up these systems. And the one thing we have learned in the last 4 years is, we always talked of our checks and balances. But the problem is the checks and balances are not mechanical locks. It's not like a dam where it automatically falls into place. Those checks and balances have to be engaged in by people. But if the people who are supposed to exercise those checks and balances abrogate their responsibility, then those checks and balances are worthless. And what we have seen in the last 4 years, so you have the inspector general who's supposed to be looking into whether there is corruption in an organization. And if you don't like the report, you fire him. How does that even begin to make sense? So again, my issue is less partisan politics and more ensuring that the processes and the institutions work.
Girish, it's really quite interesting to me looking at the United States from outside. As the two of you may know, I lived and worked and went to school in the United States for 5 years, and then moved back to Canada, where I'm from. And I found it a fascinating experience. The U.S. Clearly, incredibly successful country, probably somewhat initially just because of the size, and so an incredibly good market of 300 million people. But some of those things that made the United States so successful in the past, I wonder about, and you've addressed and touched on some of them. I think about COVID-19 as an example, and Canada has not been incredibly successful, but we have 5 times less per capita infection with COVID-19 than the United States. And, we're right next door to the United States. And so, our populace is pretty darn similar to the United States in a lot of what we do. And for us to have 5 times, like not 50%, 5 times fewer infections than the United States is astounding. And one of the things that Trump often talks about, and some of our classmates have complained about over the years, is socialized medicine, public healthcare. And Canada has one payer healthcare system, and it's worked incredibly well. And during COVID-19, if anything, what it has done is it has renewed Canadians' belief in the strength and power and equity in our system. And so when we take a look at the distribution of COVID-19 fatalities, mortality in Canada, it's far less than the United States. Mortality in the United States is far more concentrated in less advantageous economic communities. You take a look at the judiciary, and the fight that you've had over your most recent judicial appointment. I'm not going to say there's no politics in judicial appointments in Canada, but I've never known one to have a vote against it by one of the parties, and I've never seen a 5-4 or whatever split in the Canadian judiciary. Diversity. We're a very diverse country. The United States is a very diverse country, and I think that's been one of the biggest successes of the United States in history. And yet, of late, Canada has been doing really well with international students and international immigration, because people are no longer from around the world as welcome in the United States as they have been in the past. So I guess I'd react to your comments, Girish, by wondering, is what's happening in the United States actually risking the success that the United States has enjoyed for the last 100 years?
That's a very important question, right? The one thing which made the US very different, and as you know, I myself am an immigrant, came to the US to do my graduate studies. The one thing that made the US different from other parts of the world was one, it was not a feudal society. It didn't matter who your father was, it didn't matter where you were born or raised. The belief was education is a great equalizer. If you work hard and with a little bit of luck, you could be the next Rockefeller or whomever, right? So with some exception, most people at the top of politics, corporate life, etc., are many times first generation, second generation people who went to college, etc. That's one thing. The second thing, which what made the US different than other countries, was the fact that immigration always renewed the body politic and the talent base. Okay? So you always had fresh talent coming in. It wasn't a static society. I mean, I live in France, and it's clearly a very different approach to life. And you know, if you didn't go to those one or two schools, you really are not part of the establishment. Okay. But look at what has happened. Education is no longer the great equalizer. Just look at the cost of education today. It's nobody can, unless you're very wealthy, you can't afford the classes which prepare you to get into college, or you can't afford, I mean, $50,000 a year for education just doesn't make any sense. It is no longer the great equalizer. And immigration is further restricted, and therefore more and more people are not choosing to go to Canada, Australia, etc. I mean, look at who's running Microsoft, look at who ran Pepsi, look at who's running Google, look at who's running Adobe. You know, look at who the new CEO of Citibank is. These are all immigrants. So that strength is being taken away, and education now is becoming the preserve, at least higher education is becoming the preserve of rich people. And therefore, we are heading back to a feudalistic system where only the rich survive. And look under COVID, who got rich? In the 9 months of COVID, the top 1% made a lot more money, and the bottom 50% lost jobs.
Steve,
that's the problem.
Steve, what do you think? Has the hyper-partisanship in the United States and some of Trump's attacks of the institutions that Girish talked about and some of my concerns, do you risk the United States standing as the greatest country in the world?
So a couple things. Number one, talking about the recovery, the K-shaped recovery. I typically have thought about the V-shaped recovery, the U-shaped recovery, the L recovery, the K-shaped recovery that are going on now. The rich are getting richer, to Girish's point, and the poor are getting poorer. And it's really creating chasms in society that already is pockmarked with chasms. To Girish's point, stalling up leadership, I think, is a huge element at play here. That most elections historically, the Democratic candidate will veer to the left, the Republican candidate will veer to the right in the primaries, and when it comes to the general election, they'll veer to the center. Trump has not only veered to the right, he's stayed to the right, and he's really had a divide and conquer strategy. Not only divide and conquer within the United States, but divide and conquer within the world. It's really been the U.S. against the world, the U.S. against its major allies in Europe, the Pacific, around the world, in Asia, and he's really taken on friendships that are really make little or no sense with what I would call dictators, whether it's in Russia, whether it's North Korea, Turkey, around the world. And I'm not sure that's for his financial gain or his governing philosophy, but I think the U.S.'s standing in the world is threatened. Trump is really going after a number of longstanding relationships, especially with our longstanding partners in Europe. And I think, to Girish's point earlier, many of Trump's base love this because it's, let's poke the people in the eye that really don't like us anyhow. Let's show them who's boss. But I think many people in the US, many people around the world are looking for a leader in the United States that will bring and coalesce everybody together, not only within the US, but around the world. A lot of our traditional longstanding relationships.
Okay, Steve, let me interrupt you. I apologize. But I would have thought that some of those base, and they've got guns in the back of their trucks, and they're very law and order, that would have been incredibly supportive of the military. I just, and I met some of them in our class, and I interacted with some of them when I was in the United States, and clearly, you watch them on TV, et cetera. I would have thought they couldn't have understood the idea of buddying up with Putin and North Korea and Turkey, and I, when he made fun of John McCain as a loser, and military people as losers, and people that died in foreign wars as losers, I'm aghast that his base supported that. Why did they?
Well, when Trump ran for election in 2016, I think the quote was, "If I shot somebody in Fifth Avenue, my base won't care." And at the time, I thought that was ludicrous. At the time, I was like, I cannot believe anybody would really feel that way. Now, here we are 4 years later. I think his base just doesn't care. You've seen throughout the past 4 years, roughly 42% plus minus 2%, so 40, maybe 44% of Americans, whether it's going through impeachment, best of times, worst times, has always stood by him. And I think it's really an us against them viewpoint of his quote unquote base, and they just don't care. It's us versus the other guy. We want us. And I think your point to the military, I think many military professionals are taught to be apolitical. I do not know how they truly feel. I have some long-standing, long-term relationships with people in the military, as I know both you do as well. I, to this day, do not know if they're Democratic or Republican, because I never had a political conversation with them because they keep their politics to themselves. So, good point. I just don't know how they feel.
Something like 40 years ago in Canada, we had the October crisis, where a British ambassador and a minister in a state government were kidnapped by a separatist group. And we instituted across Canada the War Measures Act to dampen down any potential threat of civil unrest, and that anyone would kidnap a political individual. And these were, it was a minister in the government and an ambassador from the UK. It wasn't a governor. I was honestly, Steve, shocked that, number one, the reaction to this threat to kidnap the governor of Michigan was as little as it was, and then the president almost even encouraged it. Like, that's the kind of stuff that you'd expect to happen in Belarus or somewhere, not in Detroit, Michigan.
It's not just that he encouraged it. Just last week at a campaign rally, they're screaming, "Lock her up," for the governor of Michigan. And he's threatening to lock up and prosecute his political opponent. It's not even Belarus. It's Ivory Coast.
It harkens back, I think, was when McCain was running against Barack Obama, and somebody in McCain's audience said something about Barack Obama's religion. And John McCain, to his credit, stood up and said, "Listen, I'm paraphrasing now, but Barack Obama is a God-fearing American like all of us. He's not who you're describing. Please sit down." And he told his supporter to please sit down, relax. "You are wrong. You've never heard that once from Donald Trump. He pours gasoline on the fire every which time, encouraging the supporters, as opposed to John McCain, who stood up and said, 'With all due respect, I disagree with you. You were wrong.' Never heard that once from Donald Trump." And to his supporters, they love it. To his detractors, they hate it.
So, both of you have said that you think Biden's going to win. 4 years ago, everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and it was, 78,000 people in 3 states or something like that turned the tide in favor of Donald Trump. I think most people in Gore versus Bush thought Gore was going to win, and it came down to hanging chads after the fact that and a Supreme Court judgment that allowed Bush to win. What's going to happen in the United States if Trump squeaks it through, do you think, Girish?
I think there's a high likelihood that there will be some form of litigation, right? And that's part of Trump's strategy, which is, and again, these are things he has expressly stated. I'm not speculating. One of the reasons why the latest Supreme Court judge was rushed through was he wanted, if there's a 4-4 decision, then the lower court decision stands. But now it is a full 9-person Supreme Court, and therefore you could have a 5-4 or 6-3 or whatever. Now, the interesting part is if you look at the decisions which have been rendered by the Supreme Court in the last few weeks, if it has been a decision by, as Steve pointed out earlier, in the US, election laws are driven by state laws. And different states have different laws as to who counts what and when can the ballots come in, etc. If a judgment has been rendered by a state court on a state legal matter, the Supreme Court has so far abstained because by practice and law, the Supreme Court does not step into state law issues. There's an assumption that the state courts are the right forum for addressing state law issues. The Supreme Court has stepped in only to the extent that a federal court has rendered a judgment on a state law issue, in which case, being a superior court to the federal court, they can say something. So the question now, the only exception, as we all know, was Bush v. Gore, where the Supreme Court stepped into a state law issue, and to their eternal shame, they said this judgment does not have precedential value. Basically, they said this is a one-off, okay, recognizing that they were actually tilting the balance in a certain direction, but they didn't want this to become the law of the land. So now the question is, and the courts have always avoided Bush v. Gore, except Kavanaugh has quoted Bush v. Gore in a couple of his decisions, including a recent one. So the question is, will the ghost of Bush v. Gore rise again? And will the Supreme Court not intervene if the judgments or decisions are being made by state Supreme Courts on state laws? So that's the big unknown. The state now, Chief Justice Roberts is an institutionalist, and the assumption is he may want to not get involved and not have the reputation of the Bush v. Gore. Amy Barrett is also supposed to be an institutionalist, so we will see. So there is a big question mark as to, is this going to be decided in state courts, or will somehow the Supreme Court step in?
Steve, one of the other issues that I'm interested in that I would have thought would have gotten more publicity and visibility is that you've got potentially the first female vice president and potentially the first vice president of color. And given the age of Biden, could easily, one could imagine, become a president. And at least from the international news that I see in Canada, that hasn't got much attention, has it, in the United States?
First of all, excellent point. It's really groundbreaking appointment, groundbreaking selection, and that buzz has long since, at least in my estimation, gone away. It's really a personality contest between Trump and between Biden to a large extent, and Kamala Harris is on the back burner as much as Mike Pence is, but Kamala Harris, between being African-American, being female, is historic. And one of the big question marks is going to be, to what extent is she going to help drive the black vote, especially in Detroit? There is, what I read a couple of days ago, 1 million absentee ballots that have been not returned in Detroit for the election. In Detroit, most of them are African-Americans. If that drives the election, it'll be meaningful. If not, it won't be. I want to get back to a point that you raised earlier, if I can. A question that was asked, we had an HBS seminar a couple of days ago, which I don't know if both of you were on, but the question was asked, when do we think the election is going to be decided? It's going to be decided on Tuesday, that week, that month, that year. And I thought it was an excellent question, which it's your show, but I'd love to talk about that if you think that's worthy of discussion.
If I may just comment on the black and woman part, we've already had a black president. So being black is not that much of a big deal. We've already had a woman vice presidential candidate in Geraldine Ferraro, and we've already had a woman presidential candidate in Hillary Clinton. So from that perspective, it may not be as groundbreaking as we may assume. People have perhaps seen this before, and therefore, rightly or wrongly, don't ascribe as much weight to it as some people may.
Okay. So what about this issue, Girish, that Steve raises about it may take a couple of weeks? What's going to happen in the United States if it takes a couple of weeks, do you think, to decide the election?
It may very well happen. And there's a likelihood that it may not be decided and may head out to Congress to decide. And so then the question becomes which Congress, current, the new Congress or the old Congress. And if Congress decides, I guess the vote is by state rather than by the number of, so we'll have to see how the math works out. So you could end up with the Democrats having more congressmen, but from an electoral college perspective, you may have more states which have Republican candidates, and therefore they have the majority. So, which will further create dissension and angst and anger and potential for unrest.
Because it's going to be fascinating. We're chatting with Girish Nadkarni and Steve Schomburger tonight about what's going to happen tomorrow in the U.S. election. Stay with us. We're going to come back for some concluding comments in just a minute. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Well, tomorrow the United States goes to the ballots to elect a new president for the United States, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Steve, you were saying that you think Florida might actually decide earlier than Girish was worried about. Tell me about what you think might happen in Florida.
So articles that I've read indicate that Florida actually starts counting its ballots early that day, and they don't wait for the absentee ballots like many states until after Tuesday, after tomorrow. So if Florida starts counting its absentee ballots tomorrow on election day, it's possible that they will actually have a determination of who wins Florida Tuesday. And if it's close, it might go into litigation, might go into the chat, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's not close and Biden wins, it's possible that you might find out who the next president of the United States is tomorrow. Because
even if some of the Midwestern states go Republican, because Florida's got so many electoral votes.
Everything that I've read, and I've read quite a bit, is that Trump needs Florida to win. Biden does not need Florida to win. And if Florida...
The other thing that I find amazing is that Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Arizona are all in play. And I don't have a very large sample size. Maybe you guys have a better one. But some of the people I've spoken with in Georgia and Texas suggest that there really is huge turnout. And that huge increase in turnout is primarily with non-white and younger population groups, and that might swing those states Democratic. And if those states go Democratic, there's no chance for Trump. Is that not correct?
I've read the same articles, and Biden has literally dozens of paths to victory. Trump has a couple. He has must-win states. He has to win Florida, pretty much has to win Pennsylvania, has to hold on the states he had. And there's a lot of ifs because right now he's at best a point within each direction and at worst several points behind in some of his must-win states, which, by the way, was the same case 4 years ago. So I can't discount it and say it's not going to happen. It depends on who votes. But right now, we don't have any last-minute surprises. 4 years ago, we had the last-minute surprise when James Comey had the investigation about Hillary Clinton's emails that I think swayed 2, 3, 4% electorate. That hasn't happened yet. I don't see that happening in the next 24 hours without a last-minute surprise. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, I think, for Trump to win. Still can happen, but daunting.
Maybe, Girish, I can turn to you and ask you a question from an international perspective. I'm not sure if you know Canadian politics, but Canadian politics is somewhat similar to the United States, where the urban centers vote progressive and liberal or more left-wing, while the rural areas are typically conservative. And so therefore the swing vote that decides things is the suburbs. You've spent some time in France, and I think that we've seen Paris and the major metropolitan areas go one way and the rural's a very different way. On COVID-19, we've had protests about the lockdowns from the rural areas. Is there and London or the UK with the Brexit, where London and the major centers voted to stay in the EU, and it was the rural areas that voted to leave. Is there a major urban-rural split going on that's different than the past, or is it the same as in the past?
Well, I mean, historically, in most countries, the people in the rural areas tended to be more God-fearing, conservative, religious, etc. The cities were more liberal, internationalist, whatever. What has happened increasingly, as we know, is the rural areas have seen competition and devastation coming from places like China, whether it's in food, whether it's in jobs, etc. And so the rural areas, the non-urban areas have suffered significantly. And there are lots of cities, small towns in France, which are literally dying out, partly because of no jobs. So the young people are moving to the big cities. Some towns have literally no shops you can go to. You have to drive 40 miles away to do your grocery shopping, etc. And so, so the two common or the two most popular people you can blame are immigrants and China or Asia, however you want to define it. And so that has clearly created I don't know if it's a far left wing or far right wing, but clearly the extremes are the ones who are benefiting from that. Whether it's the populist side or the far left, or whether it's the National Front in France, they are getting more and more response. And as I'm sure you saw, starting last year, you had the Gilets jaunes in France who were protesting against the higher oil prices. And the interesting part about the Gilets jaunes is not unlike the US to some extent. It was a bottom-up, non-political, non-partisan group of people who were just frustrated and protesting, which to me is a bigger danger to the government, because if it's a politically inspired thing, you can respond to it. But if it's a natural upswing, it's far more dangerous.
Girish and Steve, thank you so much for joining us tonight, telling us a little bit about your feelings about what will happen and what you would prefer to have happen in the election in the United States tomorrow. We're all going to be watching with a great deal of interest. Thank you so much for sharing with us your views. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's our show for tonight. We're back every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. Thanks so much for joining us. Good night, everybody.